and we can get fired up. This week, obviously, we're bouncing back and forth. We spoke about distilled spirits and whiskey, agave, a couple of weeks ago. I hope this style of study is beneficial for people and that it's non-linear. I find that breaking up categories and compartmentalizing them helps me to actually remember things a little bit better and not get mixed up. For instance, by studying all of the regions of Germany on the same day and just forgetting where all the different rivers are. So that being said, today we're going to talk about more distilled spirits. Today we'll focus on vodka, gin, and rum. We'll talk a little bit about their history, the styles, the laws that are in place for those, both globally and in the EU more specifically. And then we'll talk about, well, what the cocktails you can produce from each of these. So we start with vodka. What is vodka? What's the history behind it? What's used to make vodka, the different types, and the classic vodka cocktails. So vodka is a distilled beverage composed primarily of water and ethanol. So sometimes with traces of impurities and flavorings. Traditionally, though, vodka is made by the distillation of fermented cereal grains or potatoes. Though some modern brands use other substances such as fruits or sugars. The word's rooted in Russian, meaning water, or voda. So here are the different types of ingredients that can go into vodka. The most common in Poland is rye. And really, you can kind of take the ingredient to help you figure out what country of origin it comes from. Rye is also used in some Russian vodkas. Tends to produce vodka with a nose reminiscent of sort of rye bread. It has a pleasing sweet spiciness on the palate. You'll see wheat, which is probably the most popular in general, and it is the grain of choice for sure in Russian vodkas. Wheat vodkas are frequently associated with a clean flavor, and spice, with almost a licorice-like taste and finish, with a little bit of an oily mouthfeel, kind of depending on the temperature of it. Potatoes are typically a bit more expensive. The potatoes used for vodka production have a much higher level of starch than ordinary potatoes. So these tend to have a creamy flavor texture with a weighty mouthfeel, generally sort of a specialty of Poland. Corn, which has the largest yield of the grains, is generally only used in Western vodkas associated with more of that buttery, sweet corn flavors. Grapes, which unlike grains, they don't need heat to release their sugars. Using cold maceration, fermentation, and storage process, this typically preserves the freshness of the grapes and extracts sort of a flavorful and fruity characteristic. So why drink vodka? It's colorless, odorless, tasteless. Sometimes it's overlooked, but it can also be rather beneficial whenever you're creating cocktails because it's neutral, right? And so you can utilize other ingredients to help bring flavor to your cocktails. Classic cocktails for vodka include the Cosmopolitan, the Moscow Mule, Gimlet, the Appletini, the Collins, the Chocolate Martini, Vesper, and a Lemon Drop. All things that we should be familiar with as we are working in restaurants or in retail. I know a lot of you are in the heart of December right now, getting absolutely crushed. I'm sure you're hearing quite a few calls for things like chocolate martinis right now. Gin, which is sort of the big brother of vodka, if you will. We'll talk again about what it is, what's used to make it, the history of it, the styles, the classic cocktails based around it. And this will be a bit more robust than what we saw with vodka. So what is gin? So Genever is the Dutch word for juniper. So you can see why it was shortened to gin. The base of gin is always a neutral grain spirit to which botanicals, such as herbs and spices, are added. And the botanicals that are added to the spirit, which is then restilled to create the gin's unique flavor in a gin basket, basically on the column still. But the leading botanical is the juniper berry. And the juniper berry is responsible for the pungent aroma and flavor. Producers use other botanicals such as coriander, orange, lemon peel, licorice, even almonds on occasion. And each recipe is highly guarded and unique to each house. So gin was invented by the Dutch over 300 years ago for its medicinal powers. was introduced in the 17th century by the Dutch as a tonic for those suffering kidney problems and other ailments. It gained popularity in England as the result of a demand for distilled spirits that tasted good and were inexpensive. French brandies and wines at the time were extremely taxed at that point. So the production of this new inexpensive spirit flourished, and in no time at all, gin became the national drink of England. Styles of gin, the main styles include Dutch, London, or London Dry, Plymouth, and New Western Dry. So your Dutch gin represents the original style of it. It's completely different from the variety of dry gins in the market today. It's made from infused neutral spirits and malt wine. Today it's distilled at a low proof, which produces a full-bodied gin with a clean but malty aroma flavor. It's not really used as a mixture to create cocktails because of its overpowering taste, but it can be enjoyed with, say, a dash of bitters. London Dry, or just London, really. This is the most regulated of gin styles when it comes to the EU. It's required actually to have a lower ABV, minimum 35%. Most sit at 37.5, including including vodka as well. There are a few things that London gins you'll find in the EU have a couple of different regulations on. I highly recommend that you take a look into that, just so you can sort of familiarize yourself with why that is. So the most common style of gin on the market today can be produced anywhere in the world. It's made using a neutral spirit with botanical flavors, but juniper has to be that primary flavor, and it's typically a bit more pronounced than any of the other botanicals. Great examples here: Beefeater, Tanqueray. Plymouth, of course, resurrected by Plymouth Gin themselves. It's a brand as well as a style of gin that European law dictates may only be made in Plymouth, England. It's wheat-derived, neutral-based spirit with no bitter botanicals, makes it very aromatic with a soft, clean taste. And as a result, Plymouth Dry Gin has less of an overpowering juniper flavor than many other traditional gins. However, it's heavier and more strongly flavored than say, London Dry Gin. New Western Gin. Designations. So this has evolved over the last several years as a result from efforts from both large brand houses and regional distillers in Europe and in the U.S. Let's take a good hard look at today's rather loose definition of what dry gin is. So these distilleries realize a greater opportunity for artistic flavor freedom and the great spirit in creating gins, with a shift away from the usually overabundant focus on juniper to supporting botanicals, allowing them to just about share center stage, almost as much as what juniper has here. And so while juniper still has to remain dominant in all dry gins to achieve the definition of gin, these are most certainly defined, not by juniper, but the careful inclusion and balance of the supporting flavors, creating what a lot of people believe an entirely new designation for gin that deserves its own individual recognition. Great examples of that would be Aviation, Hendrix, Tanqueray 10, and Blue Coat, where you're seeing a higher proportion of other botanicals, creating, other, say, more citrus or floral or spicy style of flavors. Rum is the third portion of this category. So what is rum? What's it used to make it? What's the history of its styles, the classic rum cocktails? Rum is pretty simple. It's a product of distilled sugarcane or molasses, but it can actually be quite unique, right? So there are basically four major styles. There's light, dark, demerara, and rum agricole. And then in the history here in Caribbean, kind of introduces in the 17th century, and then it spreads to Central and South America, where we'll see a couple of places in particular. I threw in spice rum too, just because it's a category that we need to recognize, typically achieved by simply adding appropriate spices to it in order to get that spicy flavor out of it. But light rum is more commonly distilled by the continuous method and highly likely to be charcoal filtered at the end of the day. Demerara is basically a light rum that's from Guyana. And I put a map here for you to take a look at. You can see just east of Venezuela and north of Brazil, you'll find Guyana. And then over here is French Guiana, not to be confused with it. And the Demerara rum has got to be distilled actually from molasses, so a byproduct of sugarcane already. Cachaça is one that you might find here in Brazil, just south of Guyana. which is a fermented and distilled byproduct of sugarcane. It's basically light rum. Of course, it's the key component in the caipirinha cocktail. Dark rum, which some of the best in the world come from Jamaica. It's often pot distilled twice, and then a lot of times they're finished off by adding caramel coloring. And of course, I mentioned spice rums earlier. Let me think of Captain Morgan and Sailor Jerry in those instances. Perhaps the most unique and the most flavor-driven, though, in my opinion, are rum agricole. This is really the southernmost AOP of France, technically, because this is a French-controlled island. And here's Martinique right here. You can see it just north of Venezuela and close to Guyana, kind of where that trade routes brought rum to in Central and South America. It's produced from sugarcane, and it is heavily regulated, as you can imagine. It's got to be column distilled, 10-year field age on the sugarcane, 40% ABV. There is no enrichment. No synthetic fertilizers are allowed either. I say there's no enrichment, but you can add sugar, caramel, and oak chips, so a little bit of a fine line that we're walking there. The different labelings, definitions that you might find with it are Blanc, which is 8 weeks aged, Élève sous bois, which is 12 weeks aged in oak, Rhum Ambre, which is 18 months in oak, also known as Rhum Paille, and then Vue or Hors d'Âge, which is 36 months in oak, in a maximum 650 hectoliter sized vessel. A few other labeling designations you'll find: VO, which is 36 months, VSOP, 48 months, and XO, a full 72 months of aging in oak. Pretty interesting. Handful of classic rum cocktails. You'll see a lot more depth here too than what we typically find with, say, vodka earlier. We didn't really go over the gin ones. We probably need to add that into this presentation. Classic rum cocktails include the cable car, caipirinha, the corn and oil daiquiri, dark and stormy, the fog cutter, the Hemingway daiquiri, hurricane, Mai Tai, mojito, painkiller, pina colada, and the zombie. I'll let you all do the research on how to produce each one of these. Always a fun thing to do whenever you're studying classic cocktails is seek them out, find places that you can drink them where they're well prepared in your region. And I think we can't necessarily talk about rum without speaking to the fad or designation, I guess what we're calling tiki today. Really kind of begins with Don the Beachcomber, owned by Don Beach in the 1930s in Southern California. Really, at the time, though, the drinks weren't referred to as tiki. They weren't called tiki until long after they had kind of faded into oblivion. And so one of the things to remember with tiki is the saying that goes 1 of sour, 2 of sweet, 3 of strong, and 4 of weak. So in this situation, we think of classic cocktails. We think of the martini. We think of the old-fashioned, the Manhattan. Very simple, right? There's base spirit. There is bitters. And then there's typically either a sweetener, which we would maybe say vermouth in this situation. With tiki, that blows things out of proportion. If you're going to use sour, commonly you're only going to use lime, right? Well, sometimes in tiki they're utilizing lime, grapefruit, and passion fruit. If you're using sweet, instead of just simple syrup, a lot of times you'll find maple syrup or agave or other things. 3 of strong. So in the case of the fog cutter, not only are we utilizing different rums, we're also throwing in cognac. So you might see 2 or 3 different base spirits in a tiki drink. And then 4 of weak can be any combination of things from bitters that are in smaller proportions that can help to build the complexity and the flavors of those cocktails. So they're a lot of fun. I would certainly encourage you to find a tiki bar in your region and pick the bartender's brain. They're typically some of the most passionate people when it comes to cocktail production, period. Pretty short and simple this week. That's what I have for you all. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out. Let's take a look. I am going to take a look at next week's syllabus real quick. I can get out of the screen. Pardon me. And it looks like next week we are focusing, I might change this up, on Calvados cognac, Armagnac, and brandy. I feel like we're doing a lot of spirits based things right now. Maybe we should break that up just a little bit. So we'll see. I'll keep you all posted if we're going to do that next week, or if we decide to do maybe flip-flop that with Rioja, Navarra, and Ribera del Duero. But I certainly appreciate everyone's attention today. I know it was a quick session. If you have any input, you'd like to add anything else to the presentation, please feel free to reach out. Cheers.